February 16th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people and look back at our glorious and our grave history. A tough look at where we're at now, and I look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find our audio streaming at www.ltnradionet.com, and we are streaming live with video on Facebook Live. So if you're listening to us and you want to take a look, then go to Facebook. You can find this live stream posted on my Facebook group page, Let's Talk Native, and several others. My wife shares us on many groups, so we're easy to find. Look, we opened up with Murray Porter. Since She Went Away, it is a song that he dedicated to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that still. I know we just come off the week in which we dedicated February 14th as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Awareness Day with the Red Dress Campaign and some of the vigils that took place and events that took place all over. Man, I saw some posts over the last few days about events that took place, and there were at least 30 postings that I saw of events, not just vigils, but gatherings in general to raise those issues. And I want to thank all of you who participated, and all of you who hung a red dress, all of you who took a picture of a red dress and hung it, because having the conversation, starting the conversation is part of the issue. So, hey, look, I'm John Kane. I am the show's host and producer, and I want to have a conversation, not so much specifically about about missing and murdered Indigenous women, but really a conversation about many of our issues and the fact that many of those issues are symptoms of a larger problem. I just met with a friend of mine this last couple of days, and he took a picture and he drew a picture of an iceberg. And of course, as many of you know, what you see floating in the ocean as an iceberg, what you see is a small piece of what is beneath the surface. And so, what he says is, when we talk about the conflicts that we have, and we only see a little bit of what that conflict, how it manifests itself to us, to see. Most of it, the underlying issues relating to a conflict are beneath the surface. And, so I think visualizing all of these things, what we see is missing and murdered Indigenous women. What we see is alcohol and substance abuse. What we see is suicide and overdoses. What we see is high school dropouts and teen pregnancies and, struggling economies. We see all of those things, but those are all what is visible. What's not visible is what causes and what are the underlying problems for all that stuff. So what I wanted to talk about today is not all of those things necessarily, and not even necessarily trying to pinpoint the underlying problems. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But what I want to talk about is, how are we going to address it? What are we going to use? I mean, we get into this battle sometimes about, because of the overbearing nature of the colonial societies around us. What systems do we use to address problems? Do we use their systems or do we use ours? I mean, currently we're pretty much using theirs, and so, and by theirs, look, there's a problem. What do? You call the cops, right? You see, if you do bother to take an action when you see a neglected child, you call CPS. You don't deal with it directly. When you have a dispute that needs to be resolved, again, you call the outside somehow to help you. Suicide hotlines, those are off territories. I mean, there are so many systems, and in particular the justice system, the legal system that is, that spans everything from county courts to state courts to federal courts, and and then even things that are not courts, these mediation services, they're all non-native. Arbitrations, the American Arbitration Association, international tribunals, the UN. I mean, any of this stuff. We use those systems if we even have the opportunity to use some of those systems, but we don't use ours. And in fact, we've neglected some of our systems so badly that we don't even recognize them anymore. The call that we hear a lot of lately, which is trying to learn the Guyana Goa, or what people call the Great Law of Peace, trying to learn that, is for some it's a desperation, rather than saying, no, I really want to revisit a different path forward. So if you're going to say, okay, we want to examine what are the traditional processes for resolving conflict and addressing some of the problems that we face every day, are we going to be genuine about it? Do we really want to know what the processes are? And I'm not talking about, ancient rituals. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about processes. Perhaps processes that are not speedy, processes that may take some time and some real effort to realize meaningful solutions. Our processes were about restorative, if you want to give it a word or a label, restorative justice. How do you resolve conflict, not just declare winners and losers in a conflict? That's their system. That's not our system. So when we recognize that we have violence against women, look, the numbers are really telling. I mean, when the ratio of or likelihood of a woman, a Native woman, being sexually harassed or being a crime committed against her, not just harassed but assaulted, raped, murdered. But the percentage based on our population, it's 10 times higher than for anybody else. And of course, the other number that you oftentimes hear thrown out there is that 70% of the violence against Native women is perpetrated by non-Native people, white men. Well, okay, so 30% are Native people. Look, if we're not addressing the 30% of our own people who are committing these crimes against our Native women, then how the hell are we going to address what's happening to people from the outside that we're inviting in many of these? These are domestic violence issues. Now, the problem, and the reason this number even comes up, is because the way the systems work, which are predominantly outside systems, they refuse to let us use our own systems, even if our systems replicate theirs. Let me explain. So if you're a non-native living with a Native woman and you beat the hell out of her in almost any territory, if that territory has a justice system, if they have a court, if they have a police force, or or peacekeepers or whatever, or if they have, oftentimes even if they have a BIA cop, what they call a tribal office of tribal justice police officer, who is essentially a federal employee, but if that BIA officer or whatever intends to try to prosecute a non-native in a native court, it's not allowed. It's illegal. And in fact, there are some real clear constitutional issues with trying a white man in a tribal court. Why? Because the federal government won't recognize that they won't recognize our sovereignty. They won't acknowledge that if you are on a native territory, that you are outside the jurisdiction of the United States. They refuse to do that. I mean, and I mean, they did it one time, but they found that to be very problematic. I mean, they've actually got constitutional protections that would say that the United States cannot subject a U.S. citizen to an outside jurisdiction. So in the absence of recognizing or telling an American or anybody else, once you enter a native territory, you are outside our protection. So your constitutional protections, now you're under their system. See, they won't do that. And the funny thing is, even with the Violence Against Women Act that they passed a couple of years ago, what they attempted to do was say, well, we see this as a problem because we don't have the resources to go after white men committing crimes against Native women. And currently, we prohibit that from tribal courts and tribal police from doing anything to a white man. So we'll do a couple of pilot programs. Let's recognize a few or identify a couple of Native territories that we think have a court system and a police system that meets our standards. So let's find a territory that is assimilated enough to the outside, to the state and the county or the federal systems, that we can allow them to prosecute a white person. And we'll do this on a test case basis. Well, the problem is it doesn't make the constitutional questions go away, and it's not widespread. So virtually, even with a couple of pilot programs, if you're a white man, you essentially have a license to commit crimes against women, Native women, because there's neither the resources that a state like Oklahoma, or North Dakota, they're not gonna use their white police forces to prosecute a white man committing a crime against a Native person, and of course this is Canada too. By the way, this whole cold and bushy issue. The white man shooting an Indian wasn't going to get prosecuted in that system, and yet it is still that system that we use. Not just that they use or we wish would be used against their own people. We don't take the protection of our people into our own hands. And again, I got to go back. 30% of the violence against Native women is perpetrated by Native people. And if we're not addressing that, then how the hell are we going to address what a white man's doing to our people? And it's not just violence against women, by the way. This is violence against children. And we've got some examples. I mean, I'm broadcasting from the Seneca Nation. We got some examples here of some violence that has been perpetrated against little kids by Native people. And you know what? We still didn't deal with it. The outside dealt with it. So I guess the question ends up being this conundrum, I guess, this problem that we have is, when do we start to remove the dust off of our systems? I mean, this isn't going to happen just with a great law recital. And we're actually going to step up and use some of our, our equipment and our platform here to help record some meaningful conversations so people can get a better understanding and they know they have a resource that they can go to and say, okay, all right, that's how council works. That's how the clan system works. That's what this means in a ceremony. That's what the language means. This is how the language really translates, not just the shortcut, trying to plug word for word. We're going to go through some of that, and we're going to play a role with that. Let's Talk Native, our LTN studios, our Let's Talk Native TV YouTube channel is going to play a role with all of that. But even getting that information out there, it's going to beg the question, is what are we prepared to do? And again, I've talked about a lot of issues over the years, and I've talked about the path, because that's what Guyana or Goa means. It means a I guess if you were trying to translate it literally, it would say something like a great good path or a great good way. So I mean, it seems a bit redundant, but it's the idea of not only acknowledging that there is a good way to resolve conflict, but it goes farther than that. Say, in terms of greatness, what we're talking about is something that is it's big. It's a big enough or a great enough process that anybody could use it. In fact, that's why we have the White Roots of Peace, and we say that if anybody is seeking the protection, if anybody wants to seek this process for resolving conflict, that any person, and when a man, I mean humankind, not just man versus woman, any man can follow those White Roots of Peace to the shelter of that great tree of peace. I mean, and that's why we have that. So that's why Guyana or Goa means great, It doesn't say great law. It doesn't. The word law, or we don't even have a word for law in our language, but it doesn't say great law, and it doesn't actually say great law of peace. Within that system, we talk about the tree of peace, as if it's a place, and again, metaphorically, it's a place that we can seek shelter from violence, from storm, from conflict, and when we call those white roots, we call them the white roots of peace. So the word peace is in. I mean, the concept of peace and maintaining peace is something that is a part of that dialogue, but the word Ganyanagoa doesn't necessarily, translate to the great law of peace. But so anyway, but even if we understand, even if we all could recite word for word, and even in the language or in any one of our languages, what that Ganyanagoa is, implementing it today, especially with the outside influences all around us. I mean, how did we get so far away from the Ganyanagoa in the first place? Well, it was outside influences, propping up chiefs, convincing our men to buy into the male-dominant society that white men had. We went from a place where we used a system that, again, in English, we would call it a clan system, where we resolve conflict at the family level, and then the extended family level, and then within a community, and then within a nation, within the Confederacy. We had this circles, concentric circles of about whether a matter reached the level that all of our 5 or 6 nations needed to come together to resolve, or whether we could do it within a community, or within a family. But we had that system, but it got bastardized, greed and things that people would lust after. Whether not just, and for us, it wasn't even gold so much at first. I mean, it would be anything that that would catch our eye. We became corrupted by that, and it did turn into issues of money and power and all of that influence. So we lost our way. So that path that millions of our ancestors had created with their own feet and with their own traveling across our mother, the way that we conducted ourselves, the way we journeyed through our lives for generations, became bastardized, and it became affected in ways that we no longer referred to. In fact, you can hear it said all the time that they refer to it as the chief system. When the Seneca Nation adopted a constitution, crafted with the help of Quakers and the like, they promoted this constitutional system to replace the chief system. Well, why would it replace the chief system? Why did we even have a chief system? And if you don't believe that things had gone so badly within, and we had already moved so far away from the Ganyanagoa, here's an example of it. When the Seneca Nation adopted their constitution in 1848, women couldn't vote. So, you would think that if women were taken out of the process in 1848, I mean, knowing what our women are like, you would think that there would have been hell to pay for that. There's no way that our people would have accepted that. But the reality is, women had already been suppressed and subjugated beneath the men so badly that when the Seneca Nation adopted its constitution in 1848, leaving the women out of the process was okay. There was no. You don't hear a whole lot of noise until the whole women's suffrage movement, with the United States, and women didn't become. I don't remember what the date is, but women didn't get the right to vote. I think until in Seneca Nation politics. I think until the 1960s or something like that. A century later, and I could be wrong. So I mean, I don't want to speak out of school, but clearly, the exclusion of women from the political process when the Seneca Nation threw out the chief system for a constitutional system, it's like nobody noticed. That shows you, that demonstrates how badly the Ganyanagoa was operating. That again, they didn't they didn't say, look, we don't have a chief system. We have a clan system. And that clan system involves the women. And in fact, the women have a significant role in that. Nobody even revisited that. No, we're just going to throw out the chief system. We're going to adopt something that white people help us put together. So that's how long that we have moved away from the system, but even from our own systems. But even as we did that, we still, even as we adopted different ways of governance, it went farther than that. We deviated from all kinds of systems. You know, I mean, in the midst of this for the Seneca Nation, and of course, you know, other influences that would alter how, you know, governance worked across Native territories. And again, primarily propping up, you know, a few influential men and giving them enough authority that when their signature hit a document, then you could, you know, you could say it was valid. So whether there was lands that were ceded or whether there were contracts made, I mean, you know, throughways put through your territories, you know, lands ceded for power lines, for mining rights, for drilling gas wells, for all you know, we just look. We don't need to involve the people in this stuff. Just give me the people who have the authority to sign these deals, and then commit their people and their land to it forever. See, that's how the system got corrupted. But even, you know, even with that, what you would think was just about governance, it affected all kinds of other systems. So you know, we also had residential schools that came in. I mean, and they were permitted. I mean, residential schools, as much of as an imposition as it was, Seneca Nation didn't try to stop them. Mohawks didn't try to stop them. They existed in our territory. The Mush Hole, Thomas Indian School. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't some resistance, but the political will within our governing structures, these residential schools on the U.S. and Canadian side, most of them existed on Native territories or military installations. That may not be accurate. A number of them ended up existing on Native territories anyway. And they all had, you know, they were all filled with church. You know, that was the whole objective of these residential schools was, again, remove us from our systems, eliminate our systems, eliminate the Indian, kill the Indian, save the man. That's what it was all about. So that's the legacy. That's that historical trauma that people talk about. But that's the legacy of the last, you know, several hundred years. And those residential schools existed for 100 years by themselves. Now, I will say that in my lifetime, the word sovereignty became prevalent. And a lot of misinterpretations of what that really means. But the power and the authority to make our own decisions is something that we started to wield a little bit more. But even as we did that, even as we used words like sovereignty, which wasn't our word, wasn't really our concept, again, it gets into this concept of power and who wields that power. We still had adopted our own policy of trying to emulate what the white people were doing. Oh, everything from how we governed. Not just the Seneca Nation Constitution, you know, from 1848, but the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. That was a wholesale gutting. It was essentially a wholesale ethnic cleansing of our culture. The IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, which its intent was to eliminate traditional governance. And so the traditional governance that wasn't eliminated, it would be marginalized, especially if it was really traditional. If it was already corrupted, it doesn't matter if they adopt the Constitution. We, as long as it yields what we need, and that's the way the federal government is, as long as it yields the men who will sign these documents, whatever these documents might be. That is where, that's how this plays out. And we're still battling that. So how does this relate to my last couple of shows when I talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women? Well, what are we looking for solutions? Are we looking for more pilot programs within the Violence Against Women Act? Are we asking for legislation? On the Canadian side, they got these reconciliation commissions that, are supposed to be addressing everything from the, Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is supposed to be addressing everything from residential schools to this very subject. And most of that has turned out to be a debacle. So what do we want? Are we asking the colonial system around us, our oppressors, the United States and Canada, to give us something? To give us what? To give us, more cops to protect our women? Like that's going to happen? To give us what? To reconfigure our a justice system within each one of our territories that will emulate theirs? Put their uniforms on our people, our men? Put a sidearm and a billy club strapped around their waist? That's what we're asking for? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it is what we're asking for in some places. Tribal law enforcement. What is it, a commercial on TV and, for one of those, Law and Order shows, without law, there's no order. Really? When did that happen? Because we didn't have laws, and yet we had social order. One of the primary observations made by Europeans who came and witnessed what our lives were like before we, were engaged in conflict and that kind of thing. One of the primary observations was, wow, without hierarchy, without kings and queens, without standing armies, without dungeons and prisons, these people managed to have social order. They live in harmonious lives. They have processes for resolving conflict. They don't have all the rigid institutions. They don't have laws. They have order without laws. So when you hear a white man say there is no order without law, well, yeah, you made that happen. You created that. In nature, there is order without man-made laws. The problem is that man defies nature. And what I'm saying here, and I realize I'm not offering any solutions yet. Right now, I'm just trying to make the observation is that we are not relying on who we are naturally and traditionally. We're still relying on them. And if we're asking them to legislate for us, what we're really saying is legislate over us. Now that seems counterintuitive if the word sovereignty rolls off your lips or decolonization rolls off your lips. This is where we're at, folks. So as we let the totals, those numbers rack up on missing and murdered Indigenous women, as we see their systems fail them, I mean, they've had 18 school shootings in the United States. 18 times this year already, a gunman has walked into a school and shot children. That's the system we want? And you know what? Our kids go to some of those schools. I mean, we've got to rethink some of this stuff. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to take a break. We come back out. We'll talk a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about this. But I also want to highlight and explain why that system doesn't work for them or for us. But it doesn't work for them, and it sure as hell isn't going to work for us. And I want to explain a little bit more of that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
She gave me the world, and the universe agreed. She gave me a heart, that's all that I need. She was my best friend, but I couldn't see. She needed a good man. That man was me. I wasn't thinking, I was a fool. beside me, but I was still cold. It's almost too late when I realized just what I had, what I denied. She gave me the world, and the universe agreed. She gave me a heart, that's all that I need. She was my best friend, but I couldn't see. She needed a good man, that man was me. We both knew it, but we weren't free. We both had commitments.
All right. That man was me. That's, again, more Murray Porter, and that's from his CD, Songs Lived and Life Played. And one of my favorites. Murray's got a new CD coming out. In fact, he's doing some pre-sales. If you find him online, or on Facebook, I should say, online, you can find he's got an event page, and I think a couple of pages. But look for Murray Porter online on Facebook, and you can find how to do a pre-order. Send him some money, and as soon as he gets those CDs produced, he'll put them in the mail to you. He says this next CD is the best one he's ever done. Knowing how much I like his music that he's done in the past, man, I'm anxious to see this. So, and I got to admit, I've heard some of the cuts, because he's done some of these cuts on Facebook, and produced a few videos with some decent audio to give an example of some of the new tracks that he has for the CD, and it looks really, really promising. So, hey, I want to acknowledge my sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, my good friends like Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice and Neville Spring, Sugar Montour. I want to thank all of you guys who help me do what I do. And I got to say, I don't take this for granted. It's really, for me, both a privilege and a duty that I think that I have to have some of these conversations. I think to point some of this stuff out, it's not about giving somebody hell or ridiculing anybody or criticizing anybody. I'm trying to open up our eyes on some of this stuff, and I hope that even if you don't completely agree with some of the things that I suggest here, or that I might state here, certainly if I get a fact wrong, then by all means, let me know, or put it in context. That I'm not trying to be misrepresent anything. But if I get something, if you don't agree with something I say here, at least acknowledge that there's a conversation that needs to be had here. So this conversation that I'm trying to have here about things like what our systems need to be, what we need to do to develop different ways of addressing some of our social issues. Look, there are many reasons, or there are many contributing factors to why we have a problem called missing and murdered Indigenous women. Most of it goes right back to the conditions that our people live under. Whether our people are living as marginalized people in urban areas. I mean, our people used to be. I mean, the reason AIM even came into existence back in the 70s was because of the abuse that our people were experiencing in city areas. AIM was an urban Indian organization. It was put together. These guys, assembled to protect our people in urban environments. AIM wasn't born out of on native territories, because our people were being abused so badly in these urban environments. But we also have, we're also such a marginalized people in terms of living out of the public eye. I mean, we don't exactly have TV cameras, beating on our doors on every native territory. We live in some pretty remote areas, and in fact, for many years, many years, the idea of somebody coming to our territory was considered, taboo. It was risky, it was dangerous, and it really wasn't. But it was, who would want to go there? Until we started doing some commerce and selling cheap cigarettes and gas and that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden, that these roads weren't just the cut through our territory to be the convenience for white people traveling, but all of a sudden, when the roads going through our territories became a road that you travel because you can buy some stuff, less tax on the territory. That started to change some of this stuff, and then of course gaming came in, so now, and of course, it's not like we put casinos in the heart of many of our territories. We oftentimes position those things either as close to the urban populations as possible, or some place that we could develop that wouldn't bring. I mean, we didn't want to bring traffic through our territories, and frankly, the conditions of most of our territories would not have been an attractive site, to bring would be consumers to our to our facilities. But the circumstance that our people and women in particular experience is a sense of hopelessness. There aren't very many opportunities on native territories. If you work for the tribal government, the tribe, or their enterprises, if you do have a gaming venue or something like that, that's it. But that's not enough jobs for the most part, for most places, for most people. And you know what? You look at some of the most successful native enterprises, gaming facilities, 90% of the employees, non-native. Yeah, even the upper management stuff. That's what you'll find. You'll find in most of these gaming venues, or major enterprises, these are, golden geese, perhaps. People look at these gaming as as these money-making venues. But rather than, being predominantly, employing native people, because they could view native people as being problematic. If you have no say in the governance of your territory, you could actually be considered a more valuable employee. And that's the way, and that's kind of the way it worked for many years. And of course, that ebbs and flows, and then it changes. Then you get, certain circumstances where native governance, gets corrupted by the gaming, and that then you got a tail wagging the dog situation. But for the most part, and this is where I don't want to get too far off, but for the most part, if you look at most native territories or most native lives, there aren't great opportunities for native people, native women in particular. Again, men can be laborers, right? But it's even harder for native women. If you look at you look at the what are put out there as these successful native people, you're going to find that most of the successful native people didn't get raised on a native territory. Many of them were the ones who were adopted out, and they were raised by white families. Always with that longing to go, many of them with a longing to do something, and reconnect with their territories, but they didn't get damaged by that. The damage they got was maybe perhaps abandonment, I guess. But look at some of the actresses, the lawyers, again, some of the most successful native people didn't grow up on territory. Now, I'm not saying that there's no successful native people, but how are you gauging success? Because if you're gauging that success that they made it off of their territory, well, see, therein lies the problem. Because if most of our communities, and even those communities within an urban environment, and oftentimes there are native communities right within, in New York City, there was an area they used to call Little Gunawaga, down in Brooklyn. But in most of these communities, these native communities, the greatest success you can have is breaking out of those communities and leaving. So what does that? For one thing, what does that do to our gene pool? if our best and our brightest leave, and they don't just leave for career, they leave for family. Oftentimes, not it ain't gonna be Native family necessarily if they went to New York or Washington. So what leads to much of this stuff is the conditions on our territory. For one thing, the conditions are imposed on our people. And because those conditions are imposed on our people, the non-Native public, whether it's, white men working in the man camp or whether it's some white guy who shacked up with a Native woman, they could regard Native people as beneath them, inferior. That's where the racism comes in. And it's not just racism at this redneck level. On Monday, I'm going to talk about a case. I'm going to talk about a case on Monday, and I don't have all the information here. I haven't had a chance to review it. But there's a case right now in Monroe County, which is near Rochester, New York, where there's a company that's trying to confiscate equipment that's sitting here on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation at a business here, a licensed Seneca Nation business license, who basically has possession of equipment for a guy that owes him money. Has a lien and has gone through the Seneca Nation courts to make sure that what he's done in terms of holding this equipment is legal within a system that really mirrors their system out there, but still followed. This white judge in Monroe County in Rochester saying, I'm not going to recognize that. Even as he's tried to domesticate this judgment against, for this equipment in Erie County, even Erie County said, nah, you've got to deal with the Seneca Nation court. I said, no, I won't do it. I'm a white man. I'm a white judge in a county court system. I don't have to stoop to having to acknowledge and and give any kind of credence or credibility to a bunch of Indians, playing court. I mean, that's really the attitude. So racism is at the highest levels. You heard it in the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, with some of his racist comments. You hear racism, out of Donald Trump, the president of the United States. And as I said, there's a unique racism that Native people experience, because we aren't necessarily, and I say necessarily because that's the debate here today, we aren't necessarily fighting for civil rights within the U.S. justice system or rights within the U.S. Constitution. Underlying who we are and our distinction and our autonomy is our belief, and I say our, but I don't mean all of us, but our belief that we have the right to be distinct, that we have the right to assert sovereignty, which means not use your systems. So even as we engage in commerce, we shouldn't have to create a system of regulations that mirrors yours to validate our right to do. Our sovereignty says we have the right not only to develop our own regulatory system, but to not develop our own regulatory system. We existed for thousands, tens of thousands of years, even for hundreds of years, half a millennium, hundreds of years, engaging in commerce with Europeans, and certainly with other Native people for thousands and thousands of years. But we engaged, and we didn't have systems of, we didn't have regulatory systems. We didn't have to get a license to do business as a Native person. You may have had that. And we have many of our own people saying, oh, we have to create our own regulatory system. We have to have compliance officers. We have to have, a licensing office, and we have to have rules and regulations on what? For why? Why would we do that? Well, we got to look like them. That's what I come back to. So, again, on Monday, I'm going to talk about this case of this racist judge in the Rochester area who refuses, even to the extent that federal law requires him to acknowledge Native courts, the Seneca Nation court in particular. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to stoop to that level. That's the view this guy has. Well, I'll talk about that case a little bit more on Monday. But I mean, what this demonstrates is how that system, even on paper, if it says that it's there for us. I mean, you look at the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's all kinds of rhetoric in there that says, "Oh yeah, those there has to be equity, there has to be fairness, and we can't be mistreated in this system." Yeah, look, I know it says that. I mean, there's also all kinds of language about things like racism and discrimination. And hell, the nation's capital has an NFL franchise with a racial slur, and nobody seems to have a problem with that. At least not enough white people to change it. I mean, there's all kinds of, provisions within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's all kinds of articles in that insist that nation states have to accommodate certain elements of or aspects of indigenous life, indigenous populations. It stops well short of saying that a nation state has to acknowledge our sovereignty. And in fact, they make it very clear: nothing in this declaration is intended to violate the sovereignty, or impose or infringe upon the sovereignty of the nation states. It doesn't mention sovereignty as it relates to us. And it makes it clear that nothing in that declaration is intended to encourage us to assert statehood. I mean, so even the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples clearly supplants us, places us under the nation states that they hoped would vote for this thing and approve of this thing. 4 nations voted against it when it went to vote: the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They voted against it when it went, and it was really the only time it was put to vote. They claim that they have somehow embraced, at least the aspirations of the agreement since then. Now, having said all that, I still believe that the United Nations is a forum for us to be heard and make noise. The problem is that there's nothing within that forum that holds the United States or Canada accountable for violations of that UN Declaration of Indigenous rights or human rights or any of the discrimination declarations that they've established over the years. I mean, the United Nations had a policy that was supposed to encourage decolonization. Yeah, they actually had this a whole era of UN involvement in decolonization. Pushing for the independence of colonized states. In Africa, some of those, some of that took place. I mean, Southeast Asia, South America. But even as they were doing it, the United States was still illegally occupying Hawaii, and would with their illegal claim of Hawaii as a U.S. territory, would kind of scramble to make it a state, make it one of their states. And of course, there was no effort at the UN level to address the decolonization of any native territories within the continent. No, we were totally ignored. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with us seeking refuge within the U.S. systems, the Canadian systems, or the international systems. The international community was completely complicit with the United States in their illegal occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the dismantling of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. The Hawaiians had diplomatic relations. They had like over 70 embassies throughout the world. The only non-Christian nation, or non-European nation, I should say, that had this kind of international recognition, diplomatic relations with somebody. And you know what? When the United States decided, no, we're just gonna take it, everybody just stuck their head in the sand. All those European nations who prided themselves on their advanced civilization, they turned into cowards. They turned into absolute cowards and sold out the Hawaiian Kingdom. Oh, it was great to travel to Hawaii and have these royal engagements with the king or the queen of Hawaii. Oh, yeah, that was great. Island paradise, civilized people. They had a palace and everything. But when the United States, perpetrated their crimes against the Kingdom of Hawaii, it was, and that's what we all face. Queen Liliuokalani is another statistic of abused women who were violated by white men. This at a nation state level. But we, with the sexualization of our girls, our children, the chances of us having our women live their lives without having to endure sexual assault is pretty slim. And why? I go back to it. It's because we're counting on their systems to protect them, not ours. And that's where we need to grow. We need to get the courage to step up. And as I said at the beginning of the program, we need to hold our own people accountable. 30% of all violence against Native women is perpetrated by Native men. We need to address that. But, and again, that iceberg that is the part that's under the water, the part you don't see. We need to affect the conditions of life on our territory. We're not even a big population. I mean, we represent 0.7% of the U.S. population by comparison. When people talk about how much, how easy it will be to stamp out starvation in the world if, with the amount of money spent on war, do you know how easy it would be to fix the economies of Native people? If we could draw the attention of the rest of the world in a meaningful way, especially if we came up with the solutions and we just looked for support and acknowledgement on those. I'm not asking for somebody to just throw a bunch of money at us. But in the overall scheme of things, we're a relatively small population. Native people. We're a relatively small population. And you know what? Our lands are fruitful. There's some of them are pretty remote, but they're still, in the world that we live in, there's no way that we shouldn't be able to connect. But the biggest problem is, in spite of, what really should be a satire, this State of Indian Nations address that was given last week, this week, in spite of that, which really should be, again, a satire on the United States state of it, these guys get up there and they mean what they say. When they say, oh, the State of Indian Nations is strong. And what do they talk about? Talk about mining. They talk about the relationship with the United States and all the legislative action. They don't talk about the meaningful things that we need to do territory to territory. There is very little that promotes native to native commerce. And you know what? That is a tough one for the United States. It's tough for the states to know how to deal with. How do they stop us from having native trade? New York's been trying to stop it for years. New York State is afraid to even say that they're trying to stop native to native trade. I mean, that's how difficult a subject it is for a state, as oppressive as New York State. That's where our strength is, but we still don't do it. We still don't understand the notion of local economies and economies that connect native people to native people. When we do that, then we start to develop hope for our future generations. We did it before. We were a people who were experienced in trade. Ganondagan used to be a place, now a state park, essentially, Ganondagan. It's where it was a central location for us to store massive amounts of food. And it wasn't just about trade in terms of trade for wealth, but it was about trade in terms of how we made sure that we helped each other. We supported each other. Really, that's what trade is supposed to be. Trade isn't supposed to be how much you can screw somebody with the product that you have and what you want to get for it. That might be the American version of it or the European version of it. But what trade is supposed to be is how something that you have and something that I have can benefit each other. I have a surplus, you have a surplus, I have a need, you have a need, and we have a fair and equitable act of commerce that comes out of it. We should be doing that, and it doesn't even really require money. I'm not just talking about some crude idea of bartering, but that too. We need to have give some serious consideration for making our way back to our path. That Guyana or Goa, the path that supports us, that supported us for 10,000 years. We're off of it. And being off the path isn't the terrible part. It's failing to recognize that you're off the path and having no freaking idea how to get back. That's where it's a problem. We're a free people. So the idea of stepping off that quote-unquote red road is something that we have the right to do. I mean, even within our culture. But you step out, and that's how you evolve as a people. That's how you develop things. That's how language develops and how sports develop, how you engage with other people, native and non-native people. But you don't lose your way in that process. The problem isn't stepping off the path. The problem is not ever knowing your way back. That's where we're at today. That's the conversation I wanted to have today. On Monday, I'm going to talk about this specific case that I mentioned, and I'm going to go through some of the documents, and I got a stack of documents in inch thick, so there's plenty to go through it, and I'm sure I'm going to come up with some pretty racist comments out of this white judge in Monroe County near Rochester. But it's going to be interesting. And again, one of the things that I think that is really important that we do is that we begin to have an understanding that we need to develop our own processes for resolving, or we need to dust off some of our old processes and modernize them. How do we resolve conflict? How do we reach out? How do we communicate? How do we, make sure that that we don't just send our worst people to some other territory to do it and inflict crimes on somebody else, for instance? And how do we not necessarily feel like we have to obligate ourselves to the U.S. and the state justice systems that are anything but just, or provincial or Canadian federal? We need to recognize that those racist systems they're not even intended to assist us in resolving the problems that we have on our territories. In fact, those systems created many of the problems on our territories. So that we have to acknowledge that. And we have to rethink what is the process going forward. I mean, trying to create a native version of the failing systems out there is not going to serve us. I look forward to spending some time with teaching people the Guyana or Goa and being a part of that being what we do here. All right, folks, I'll see you on Monday. Thanks for listening. Yahweh.
Red blue,